Today, our presenter is Raymi Beltran. Raymi is a Senior Environmental Specialist and Regional Team Lead with IFC's Environment, Social, and Governance Department based in Istanbul, Turkey. He has over 18 years of experience in environmental and social management, working on oil, gas, mining, and infrastructure projects in Europe, the Middle East, Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Raymi has been with IFC for 8 years, working closely with private sector companies in assuring compliance with IFC's performance standards, the EHS guidelines, and adopting good international industry practices. His prior experience includes several years in environmental engineering consultancy in the United States, as well as private sector work for large oil, gas, and mining companies in the U.S. and Latin America. With that, I will turn the webinar over to Raymi to begin.
Thank you very much, Rashnika, and good afternoon from Istanbul to everybody. Thanks for joining this webinar, this presentation. I'm going to start with some key terms which are going to be used throughout the presentation and will help us understand better the various topics. I'm not going to go through all of them, but the main ones I just want you to understand are around contractors. What we call a contractor is a company or an individual who is under direct control of the client. A mitigation hierarchy, you have probably heard of this term, mitigation hierarchy. It's used throughout a performance standard and focuses on avoidance, minimization, management, and offset. When we're talking about environmental and social, we refer to also health and safety, and within that, we are talking about the various environmental, social, and health and safety aspects which are related to the type of work we do and which are included in the performance standards. When we say a good international industry practice, we are referring to performance standards and other lender standards. And the commitment register is a commitment, it can be as simple as an Excel, but it's a list basically of all the commitments that the project needs to follow, which can come from various source documents. It's a very good way of synthesizing the information, the project commitments around ENS. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So with that, I want to move into some of the current challenges we have been seeing in IFC projects. Many of our specialists and our clients have been extremely challenged on the impacts, the risks, and also the impacts from the lack of proper contractor management. Many times, even though the client can have good systems, it's the contractor who, because of a lack of control or lack of management, can create the biggest impacts. The other challenge we see is that project staff are many times unaware of the environmental and social requirements that should be integrated into hiring contractors. There are various phases in hiring contractors and subcontractors, and it's important to understand when and where these requirements need to be incorporated into this process. Into that, it is a process. Contractor management is not just one piece of the puzzle, but it's a systematic approach which allows for an effective understanding of the requirements and then control and enforcement of the issues. And also the current challenges we have seen is that if there's any type of contractor management, it is related mainly to management of risk, but not to look at opportunities for improving the performance on other aspects. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. So based on these challenges, we decided to develop this good practice note. The reason for it is we hadn't seen similar practical guidance out there, and it is something needed by all our clients and our specialists, and not only IFC clients, but in general, anybody working with contractors. This good practice note has been developed through a review of various specialists, both within IFC. Senior people within IFC have reviewed and commented, together with external input. We have included external consultants, senior consultants, and also colleagues from the World Bank Group together with actual industry project managers with a lot of experience in actually managing contractors. So it has had a lot of input. It builds on extensive experience of us working in the private sector in challenging settings and environments. And it has been developed under a practical approach. It is quite succinct, quite streamlined, because it focuses on the key steps that are needed for effective management of contractors around environmental and social. I also want to mention that it's applicable to all sectors and varying risks of projects. This is not just a good practice for large infrastructure projects or large oil and gas projects. It's really here focusing on the process more than the content. So I would like you to keep this in mind when going through the slides. The risks or the amount of information that goes into each one of these steps is, of course, commensurate with the risk, but still the process applies for large and small projects and sectors. So let's start with an overview of how we manage contractors. As many of you know, we usually start with some type of a risk assessment. In this case, it can be an ESIA, an environmental social impact assessment or similar, to try to look at opportunities to apply the mitigation hierarchy. In this case, it's really looking at first avoidance of the issue to de-risk the project and moving through management and offsetting as needed. Key in this process is, of course, the integration of the ESIA process with the design. We focus very much on this process, which is an ongoing and key step to engineer out and de-risk the project. ESIAs and the design of a project cannot go separate or separately. They need to go in parallel and they need to be integrated. So a lot of communication and coordination needs to happen. Following an ESIA and the integration of different aspects into the design, there is a need to develop the ESMS, the Environmental and Social Management System, for the various phases of the work. And I want to focus here on effective implementation of the management system is key once it's developed. The management system and the manuals are basically, good source documents and good documents, but they are pieces of paper at the end, and they need to be effectively implemented on the ground with the right resources, staff, and equipment. And within this ESMS, within this environmental and social management system, contractor management is key for a project to manage environmental and social risks effectively. Some basics before we get into the details. It is important that this process have ENF professionals as part of the contractor selection team. Having ENF professionals allows for early consideration and integration of environmental issues from the onset, from the start. It allows for alignment and agreement on the process throughout. And it really helps the project selection team or the contractor selection team understand what the key issues are, so these issues can be addressed through the subsequent phases of contractor selection. I want to also mention here that the qualifications, the experience, and even the interpersonal skills of the ENF professionals is important. Engineers and project managers have a specific language, quote unquote, which in terms of managing contractors, and it's important that the ENF professional has had that experience, is practical, and can communicate effectively with the project manager and the contractor selection team for effective integration of ENF. The other basic piece of information is that good international industry practice dictates that ENF requirements document, or what we call in many cases a contractor management plan, be prepared initially. This contractor management plan basically consolidates the various requirements from various source documents. When I say source documents, we're talking of several pieces of information which contain ENF requirements. It can be the commitment register, It can be IFC's Performance Standards and EHS guidelines. It can be the ESIA amendments or additional requirements from the government. It can include legal obligations and applicable codes and standards, and even ESAP requirements, Environmental Social Action Plan requirements. Having these CMPs, having this document, this Environmental and Social Requirements document, provides a comprehensive and structured way to include all the ENS considerations into one single document, or a number of documents, which are then moved through the process of contractor selection. What are the benefits of this consolidation of requirements into CMPs, Contractor Management Plans, or ENS requirements document? It improves the understanding of the contractor on the commitments for this project. It provides clear definition of responsibilities, who needs to do what as the construction starts and moves into operation. It spells out several specific needs for the project, be these training needs, be these reporting needs, and how the contract is going to be measured on environmental and social. And it spells out the mitigation and performance improvement measures and actions to address the identified risks and impacts on the project. In this next slide, we've tried to picture the process. Basically, on the left, you will see the various source documents, which should translate into a consolidated, concise ENS requirements document, what we call in some projects contractor management plan or plans, which then should translate into the request for proposal, the legal contract, and the actual proposal from the contractors. This is a good practice for managing contractors. Again, some of the benefits of doing it this way is it consolidates a lot of different separate documents. It allows for a better understanding of ENS requirements by the bidding contractor. Bids can more effectively integrate all these requirements in terms of financial resources, human resources, and technical considerations. And it allows the client to be able to compare different proposals on the same terms, basically what we call apples to apples. So we're moving now into the phases and activities of contractor selection as they relate to the different phases. We will go through each one of these. We will go through pre-qualification, solicitation, proposal evaluation, and contracting, and how they relate to the various project phases. We've put a few here: mobilization, construction, demobilization. We'll talk a bit about client monitoring and also contractor monitoring and requirements. All this basically guides us towards good ENS performance and good international industry practices for managing contractors. So let's move into the first phase of pre-qualification. This is, of course, the initial phase in the contractor selection process. It basically is important because it allows the client to filter out contractors according to some established criteria. It can allow the client to also identify red flags of these contractors, and if needed, if they can be quite significant, it serves also for disqualifying some contractors from the onset. The pre-qualification process can be quite simple for small projects, and it can even be as simple as requesting contractors to provide questionnaires. In the annex of the good practice note, we've included one example of a questionnaire. Of course, these need to be tailored to the project and the context. And in the pre-qualification and the questionnaire process, the number of documents and the level of information should be, of course, commensurate with risk. It is important we keep this in mind. Again, as I mentioned, the process is important. The amount of information and the amount of requirement will be commensurate with the size of the project and the risk of the project. And the responses to the questionnaire should give the project selection team a good understanding or a better understanding of what are the contractors' capacities and their understanding of the project ENS issues. Let's move on to solicitation. It happens basically, the initial phase is the preparation of a request for proposal. This request for proposal is usually prepared by the procurement group with input from the project manager, legal experts, and also environmental and social specialists. The request for proposal should include the specific requirements for the project, including the various ENS requirements. When we talk about this, we're mentioning the CMPs and the environmental and social requirements document. What should be included in the CMPs? There's a list of information in the good practice note, but I'll go through a few of them. Relevant requirements of the client for the various ENS issues related to the project, relevant or numeric standards and requirements for the various ENS aspects. What are the requirements according to any approved permits or commitment register? Documentation regarding design requirements. And also, it's a good opportunity here to also include opportunities for incorporation of other key issues. If we want this project to look at gender, for example, in a more systematic way, or we want biodiversity to be highlighted, this is the place to include specific requirements on the EPC contractor or on the contractor for when developing their bids. Another example could be local content. Maybe the client wants to maximize local content, and this should be specified in the solicitation process for the contractor. Let's move on to the second part of solicitation, and this is more for what the contractor needs to be providing as part of a request for proposals. This is, there's an extensive list in the guidance note or the good practice note, but they will need to provide information on their environmental social management systems, certifications, what their capacity is for managing the various key sensitive issues for the project. What about their past environmental and social performance? Again, when we're saying environmental and social, we're talking also about accidents and incidents and lost time injury frequency rates. Whether they have any existing policies. Maybe they have policies on sustainability. Maybe they have policies on water management, etc. Key here is also affirmative statements on their control over subcontractors. This is key, as the contractor can have clear understanding, but it's really at the subcontractor level where many of the impacts can occur because of a lack of understanding and a lack of capacity. Ultimately, the contractor is responsible in the eyes of the client for managing all its subcontractors. And of course, in the solicitation and in the bid, there should be information on costs, timelines, and organization. We move on to proposal evaluation. And what we are discussing here is having a process to be able to compare the various bids and be able to, through a quantitative or semi-quantitative process, be able to rate these bids in terms of not only their financial and their technical aspects, but also their environmental, social, and health and safety robustness. For this, it is important to establish criteria, which can be quite simple for simple projects or quite extensive for large complex projects. And this criteria of how the bids are going to be measured should be also included in the bid package so that the contractors bidding understand the relevance of ENS for the project. As part of this evaluation criteria, the weighing of environmental and social over technical or financial needs to also be discussed with the project team. How much weight, in other words, how much weight or how much importance of the overall rating of the proposal will be dedicated to environmental, social, and health and safety. Within this, for complex projects, we can break it down even more for sensitive issues. Maybe labor is a sensitive issue, maybe biodiversity is a sensitive issue, maybe security is a sensitive issue. So we can even have more detailed quantification systems for the overall rating of the proposal, the quality of the proposal. The criteria should be measurable and can include various aspects. Here are a few only: existing environmental and social management systems, the robustness of their organizational capacity, past environmental social performance, etc. As I mentioned earlier, it is key for this phase to also include an environmental and social professional. Of course, it is ideal that it's the same professional who has developed the solicitation process and gone through the pre-qualification, as they understand the history of the project and some of the requirements. I'm sorry, just having a bit of a glitch on the IT side. Let's see.
Continue. Hi, Raymi. The gray square is gone. Continue.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yes, I cannot move the slide for some reason. Okay, I think we're good. We'll resume. Okay, we move on to contracting, and when we're talking about contracting, there are several contracts, different types of contracts out there. There are standard international contracts, and many companies have their own models which they use, which includes, in many cases, some provision of ENS. It is important that the requirements of ENS be incorporated into these contracts, and that's where the environmental and social specialist should be inputting its feedback into this. As part of that, of course, the client representative, it's important to make sure that this is done. Again, contracting and making sure that the legal aspects of this contractor management process is the safest or the most effective way of controlling contractors. If it's not written in the contract, it's not going to happen. So it is important that the contract include all this necessary provisions for this for the project. There are several aspects that need to be included in the contract. A few of these, of course, include project-specific requirements, allocation of resources, the people that need to be part of the project, whether there's a need for additional plans that need to be developed, whether there's a need for additional training, what are the monitoring requirements that are needed for the project, bill of quantities, and adequate costs and timelines for environmental and social management. As we mentioned before, explicit commitment for compliance of the project with the requirements by the contractor and its subcontractors. And also penalties, information on penalties, incentives, and incentives to motivate good environmental and social performance. Again, all of this should be reviewed by the ENS representative of the client to make sure these aspects are incorporated within. I will pause here for some questions that may have arise from this initial part of the presentation.
Hi, Raymi. We have quite a few questions coming in. First one, can we address challenges involved with EPC versus split contract arrangements?
Okay, should I take a few or should I just go ahead and answer these?
I can give you a few if you like. Let me give you another one. Can we also touch on assessment criteria, often hard for project owners to balance quality, price, and ENS? And one more, can you share guidance on selection of contractors where the national local government agency is your partner and you have to follow the government regulations on contract selection, which usually is the lowest bid or gives priority to national contractors who may not have requisite experience?
Very good. Thank you. I'll try to answer these. Go with the last one. I think, if I understand correctly, yes, I think it is key. First of all, it is key for all parties involved in the project to understand what the requirements of the project are. And in many cases, in many jurisdictions, of course, good practices or the performance standards go beyond local legislation. In that sense, it is important to get support from the government. In my experience, it has been very important to get that support and to be able to try to influence how the project is managed beyond local legislation. So I think information, first of all, is quite important. It is also quite important to make sure that if local contractors are bidding jobs, that they also understand what these ENS requirements are. This is where the contractor management plan, or the document called an ENS requirements, is very effective. And it can, again, be a number of these plans to consolidate a lot of information for more complex projects, or a simple document which consolidates this for a less risky project. But having this up front and including it in the request for proposal is going to be key to make sure that the contractor, be it local, be it international or regional, understands what they're getting into and can put the necessary resources, both financial, organizational, and technical, to get the job done. This is where it is important to review proposals and see and assess how well the contractors have understood the requirements for the project. The second question was related to the assessment, I think how to weigh environmental versus technical. It is all project specific. I was recently working on a project in Asia, which biodiversity aspects were extremely sensitive, and water aspects as well. So in that project, technical was, of course, is quite important. So we had given it, I think, 50%, with financial 25%, and environmental, in this case, with biodiversity as a focus, 25%. So it really depends on the project, and it's on a case-by-case basis. As I mentioned, it is important this criteria be established early on and with the contract selection team, and that this information be also sent to the bidders so they understand that they need to do a good job on ENS and present that in the proposals. The first question around the challenges, not sure if I understood it correctly, challenges around EPC and lead contracts. Not sure in what extent or what kind of challenges. Maybe if I can expand a little bit on this. EPCs, or the challenges of EPCs, usually large EPCs have their own way of doing things and don't want to adopt or change the way they are accustomed to doing things. So that can be a challenge, definitely, and those issues need to be discussed at the beginning. It is important, if the EPC has certain standards, to measure those standards with, say, the EPC requirements document or the contractor management plan to see which ones are more stringent, and to use those, of course. So it is important to have close communication and understanding of the systems of the EPC, and make sure that whatever project requirements are included in the contractor management plan or the ENS requirements document can be adopted by the EPC. I'll stop there. Tigis, any other questions, or should I move on?
There are a couple other questions. What are practical solutions in the following scenario? The agreement with the contractor has been signed. There is an ENS requirement in place. However, there are huge gaps with the ESMP and commitment register, given that ESIA was revisited. Contractor is difficult and doesn't want to deviate from anything that is outside the ENS requirements. Another question, for the CMP, my experience is that the client will put an umbrella or broad requirements asking the contractor to comply with all applicable ENS requirements. In your experience, is a more detailed CMP required? Would you like additional questions, or is that?
Yes, I can measure those. I can talk about those.
Okay.
Yes, I'll start with the last one again. Everybody, I'll be a bit direct here. I think every contractor who wants to win a job will indicate that they can meet the requirements. And this is normal because they want to bid a job. And in many cases, they will have open or general statements saying, we will meet IFC's performance standards, or we will meet good international practices, and they might be the lower bidder, which allows them sometimes to get the job. This is where the evaluation of the criteria is important. But that further on, it is, just to answer that question, these general statements are, in my experience, merely statements, and they really do not represent a thorough understanding of what the ENS requirements are. Therefore, the contractor, when bidding, should look at what all the requirements are for this project, included in this CMP or in this ENS requirements document, and in detail be able to incorporate what are the implications of achieving these in terms of their budget, and in terms of their timelines, and in terms of their technical considerations and their organizational capacity. So the short answer is, general statements are there and they're good, but that's not going to cut the cake. Basically, the contractor needs to understand exactly what they're getting into, and this needs to be reflected, and this is key, this needs to be reflected in the financials of the project. And when I say financials, it's talking about equipment, it's talking about organizational capacity, it's talking about additional resources, etc. If that is not translated and it's not in the financials, it's not going to happen. Could you repeat the first question, Rashnika? I couldn't pick it up very well.
Sure. What are practical solutions in the following scenario? The agreement with the contractor has been signed. There is an ENS requirement in place. However, there are huge gaps with the ESMP and commitment register, given that the ESIA was revisited. Contractor is difficult and doesn't want to deviate from anything that is outside the ENS requirements.
Yes, this is a very challenging point to be in. That's why, again, it's so important to set the expectations from the start on what the project commitments are going to be. If one is in this situation, I've seen projects go back, if the commitment or the requirement is to meet higher standards, for a gap analysis to be done of existing designs, existing management plans, and for addendums or supplements or revisions of design be done to be able to meet these applicable standards. If we're talking from a lending financial institution, it is quite clear what the standards are, and if the project wants to work with financiers, with lenders, they might need to do this gap analysis to be able to demonstrate that the objectives of the performance standards or other lender standards are being met. It is very difficult, it is very challenging, it might take change orders at the beginning, but it's better to have this clear from the beginning, because those change orders are going to come down the road definitely if this is not understood, and then the client starts asking for additional requirements to what was agreed. Over to you, Rashnika or Tiju.
Okay. I think we'll have to continue from there, Raymi. We'll be controlling the presentation from here because there were some technical issues, so just let us know when you need us to advance the slides.
Sounds good. So if we can move on to the next slide.
Move on to the next slide.
So the next slide. The owner, and when I say the owner, the client remains responsible to meet the project environmental and social requirements. It is key for this management to be effectively for the responsibilities to be clear between the owner, the contractor, and the subcontractor to avoid duplication and also avoid any gaps in the process. Clients should ensure contractors employ qualified ENS specialists and ENS personnel, which is commensurate with the experience, needs to be commensurate with the scope and magnitude of the risks. in terms of managing contractor, it is important to have discussions and put it in the legal contracts and in other documentation. What is the role of the client in terms of approving any trainings, approving any management plan development? What are the frequencies of the audits? What are the monitoring programs that need to happen? Clear responsibilities between what is being monitored by the client versus what is going to be monitored by the contractor or the subcontractors. What are the reporting requirements, agreed different frequencies? What is the frequency of maybe regular meetings on site between the various contractors to be able to share information and challenges and opportunities for improvement? Next one, please. Okay, mobilization, construction, and demobilization. So, important here to understand that mobilization can be the phase with the most or the significant risk for the project. Many projects, basically, or many companies or clients can say construction is going to be where my impacts are happening, but it's really mobilization when the building of the roads happen, when the land is cleared, when the contractor is hiring people from the community, when stakeholder engagement happens. So it is important to manage this initial phase very carefully and to have the systems and the plans and the processes in place for mobilization to occur. As I had mentioned before, key for managing any of these phases is the readiness of implementation of the management system. A management system is great to have as a manual, but it doesn't do any good if it's only in paper. It needs to be readily implemented, and for that, a certain amount of time is also required for trial and error, especially on young EPCs. When I say young, maybe institutionally young on environmental and social aspects. So the implementation aspects of the management system are key. It is important also for the client to review the contractor management plans, procedures, etc., which are going to be done for the project to make sure that they are compliant with the said requirements, either the performance standards, the contractor management plan, etc. Many times these plans are done by consultants, and it is important that these plans be internalized, quote unquote, by the EPC, because they're going to be the ones that need to implement them and put the resources for moving them forward. Clear definition on monitoring responsibilities is also very important. Again, there are certain aspects that the client might want to do themselves, but there's definitely other aspects that the contractor or the subcontractor will be doing. It is important to have clarity at the beginning to avoid duplication, and not only to avoid duplication, but for the data to be readily used. If water is going to be sampled, a definition of where the contractor versus the client will be monitoring water, what methods are they going to be using, what analytical labs potentially will be used, and detection limits, so that the data can be used by everybody. There's so many bad examples when duplication and lack of coordination have made the data quite unusable because of just various aspects related to analytical data monitoring. What are the kickoff meetings? Kickoff meetings are important, and important to clarify expectations. Maybe there are certain issues around training. Maybe there's issues around security. So definitely kickoff meetings are quite important. And training. What are the training needs? Many times there's standard inductions. These standard inductions need to be tailored to the specific project. I mean, they can be as large and as small as the risk of the project needs, but they need to be tailored for the project. And in many cases, in high-risk projects, or not only in high-risk projects, but in many projects, ongoing training and specific training on certain topics is needed, depending on what are the challenges being faced by the workers and by senior management. Next one, please. Client-owned monitoring. We'll have one slide on monitoring. Monitoring by the client should continue through the various phases of the project. The frequency of the visits, again, as I mentioned, need to be commensurate with the risks and also on the performance of the contractor. One suggestion is, as for sensitive projects, of course, but I would say for any project, as the management system is being implemented, the main issues and challenges are going to start at the beginning when mobilization happens. And it's important that the client monitors the various pieces of the plan, do, check, act to make sure that any gaps are addressed readily. It's important to review documentation, look at records of the activities. It is important to also think about what the monitoring team should look like in order to get the most out of the monitoring visit. Is translation needed because the local language is different, and community meetings will be most effective if there's a translator on board? Is biodiversity an issue, and hence a biodiversity specialist needs to be involved to understand the details of how they're managing biodiversity? Maybe it's occupational health and safety. So looking at the challenges of the project, it's important to make sure that the right team and the right people are part of the client's monitoring team for the contractor. In many cases, especially in high-risk projects, consideration should be taken to resident specialists as well, resident ENS representatives of the client. As I mentioned, early on it's key, but maybe it's so sensitive that client visits every 2 weeks or every month just won't cut it. So it's important potentially to have an ENS resident who is helping the contractor overcome many of the challenges of their ongoing work. And also it's important to have clarity around raising non-compliances and work stoppage notices. This is quite sensitive, but it should be part of the contract, and it should be part of the CMP in terms of how non-compliances are raised, when a certain level of non-compliance is raised, and what will trigger potentially a work stoppage. All these things should be clearly spelled out in the legal contract and in the project documentation. Contractor-owned monitoring, just a few lines here. It is important for contractors to keep track of their subcontractors, yes, basically they need to be responsible for these subcontractors, and clear responsibilities should be defined with the client and their subcontractors in terms of monitoring requirements, locations, parameters, methodologies, reporting of results, etc. All of this information, again, should be included in the initial documents of the request for proposal, which is the CMP or the ENS requirements document. And contractor reporting on ENS performance for their work and that of their subcontractors is also important. We've seen monthly in many cases, again, based on the sensitivity of the project, it can be more frequently. These types of reports need to include, of course, safety and occupational health and safety issues, environmental incidents, spills, maybe changes in staffing, replacements, whether there have been any social grievances or any stakeholder engagement activities if they're involved in stakeholder engagement, any trainings carried out during that reporting period, maybe any security incidents or new risks that have changed, or any modifications to the management system which have occurred based on an ongoing continuous improvement process. We're almost at the end of this. I will finalize with a sensitive topic, a couple more slides, financial management. As I mentioned earlier, key for contractors to be able to understand the ENS requirements to translate this into the financials of the work. However, as we know, performance is not going to always be ideal, and there will be times when performance is inadequate. That's where the close monitoring of the contractors and the subcontractors is important. But what we are seeing is that good practices around ways to address ENS issues is related to payment of invoices. And again, all of this needs to be specified in the contractual legal agreements, what will trigger actions or for non-payment or withholding of payment. And this, again, should be very, very clear in the contract. And it is important that the ENS representative work with the project manager before approving invoices to make sure that ENS requirements have been met. Again, back to the communication and close teamwork with the project manager. Before an invoice for a contractor is approved, the ENS specialist should be sought, should be asked, and if there are any pending ENS issues, they should be closed before the invoice is paid. The good practice note talks about different types of financial instruments, including partial or complete withholding of payments, or even back charge to contractors. Again, this is part of the legal contract, but if the contractor is not ready to resolve an issue, and it's a significant issue, the client might need to step in with a third party, solve the issue, and basically back charge or withhold payment to that contractor on that particular topic. As I mentioned, close coordination between the project managers and the ENS representatives is essential. Good, so we've come back to the end of the presentation. Just a few takeaways from my side. This good practice note provides a roadmap and tools to develop projects in line with IFC Performance Standards and good international industry practice. It is focused on process, and it can apply to projects in many sectors and in many different risk environments. What is key here is that the process be followed at the various phases of contractor management for effective ENS performance. It is also important to know that selecting good contractors from the onset, from the start, will ultimately save money and time for the project manager and for the client and for the company. There's a lot of empirical experience and also a lot of documented experience on the value of managing ENS risks and how this can impact on the actual operational side of things for projects. So ultimately it will save time and money. It is important to consolidate all these requirements into a concise document. We called it an ENS requirements document, or a CMP, to be able to pull from the various source documents which are there and which are all over the place. It is important to consolidate this information and include it in the request for proposal for clear understanding. Integrating these aspects into the contractor selection process is the most effective way we've seen of addressing environmental and social risks of projects. As I had mentioned before, this integration will allow for a better understanding by the contractor of what they're getting into and what resources, be these financial, be these technical, be these organizational, etc., they will need to be able to effectively work on that project. Having all this integrated and a clear roadmap will also allow the client to be able to measure and monitor and enforce the requirements for the project. Ultimately, again, this good practice note is an initial stab, an initial piece of work based on the needs. We understand as its application increases, we will want to enhance it, improve it, reformulate it with additional experience, practical experience through its application. Thank you very much. Back to you, Tigis, Rashnika.
Hi, Raymi. We have quite a few questions coming in. I'll give you a couple at a time again. Please describe a strong owner's team. Who should be on it in terms of skill set? Next question, how do you deal with it when a lender is brought in at a later stage? Do you require amendments to the legal contract between the project sponsor and their contractors to reflect ESAP and other DFI requirements? And one more question. Yep. Is it possible to include environmental and social performance of contractors in the IPC where the payment is in tandem with compliance levels to the commitment? What are some suggestions on how this could be done?
Very good. Yes, very good questions. Owner's team, again, it will depend on the nature of the project. As I mentioned, if we're talking about contractor selection, it usually is a project manager. It can be an environmental specialist. It can be a social specialist as well if social aspects are quite difficult. But I also have seen companies in highly sensitive environments to include at certain stages certain highly specialized people. Let me give you an example. When rating proposals, if environmental has a certain weighing, and as part of that, say biodiversity has a key weighing, to bring in a biodiversity specialist to compare the proposals and look at how well they've understood and integrated the requirements for the project. Maybe a generalist ENS specialist cannot do it, and maybe a biodiversity person is needed. Maybe there's a, it can depend on the nature of the project. But for sure, I guess the key message I want to leave everybody with is this process needs to incorporate an environmental and social specialist or representative at a minimum, and they should be part of the entire phase of contractor selection and procurement. Second one has been on lenders. Yes, many times we get in late, and yes, we also require that a gap analysis be done and that the gaps be closed. There's different ways of doing that, but just for your information, we need to demonstrate as part of our financing that the various requirements, be these the performance standards, be these the EHS guidelines, etc., are going to be met. And we need to demonstrate this to our board. Together with the opportunities and the positives of the project, we need to demonstrate that risks are being mitigated adequately according to our standards. So what we require when we come in late is for a gap analysis or an audit or a review of a design. And if key issues, material issues are lacking, we do ask that these be closed through additional agreements with the EPC, design engineering team, etc. So I guess the short answer is yes. Rashmika, could you repeat the third one? I don't think I understood it very well on performance and performance of ENS.
Okay. Is it possible to include environmental and social performance of contractors in the IPC, where the payment is in tandem with compliance levels to the commitment? What are some suggestions on how this could be done?
Yes, the short answer is yes, and this is where the bill of quantities comes into play. When requesting a bill of quantities as part of the solicitation, there should be specific line items for various ENS aspects, and it can be as detailed as the development of different plans and the implementation of those plans over time. So let me just give you an example. The contractor needs to meet the waste management plans of the CMP, and as part of that, they might have a capital cost and they might have an operational cost, an operational and maintenance cost, maybe broken down by years. So so payment is directly linked to the performance of that contractor in implementing that CMP. This is just an example, but the short answer is yes, and it should be included in the bill of quantities. The other maybe example I can give, or the other good practice is, in many cases I have seen projects separate or request the separation of the financials from the technical. And when I say technical, it's both the engineering, but also the environmental and social. And for the financial not to be opened until it has passed the technical screening. So basically, two different packages, one for financial, one for technical, and for the technical team to approve the technical aspects of the project or disapprove it, and only then and there the financials are opened. This way, price doesn't impact the final decision for selecting a contractor. Back to you.
Okay, we have a lot more questions. Let me give you the next couple. Consolidating source documents doesn't seem feasible as it would turn into an enormous document. For example, consolidating a sustainability management system, EIA, and ESAP. What do you recommend? Next question. Many times it's difficult to identify and assess the significance of impacts for the work that will be performed in the contractor's yard. This could be because you don't know the sensitivity around the contractor's yard. How would you prepare yourself for the contractor's E&S management? And one more question. Can we also look at how to establish battery limits between ESMS from contractor and those from the company, and or how these two systems can speak to each other? Raymi, are you there?
Yeah, sorry, I was on mute. Sorry about that.
Okay, no problem.
So I'll start with the last one and move to the top. ESMSs, of course, it is important that they are aligned. In most cases, ESMSs will follow a standard international model, be this ISO, OSHA's, etc. So if they're following this model, the Plan, Do, Check, Act model, they will contain the various elements and programs and plans aligned with the Plan, Do, Check, Act. So there should be the process of aligning them should be quite straightforward. But it is important these are aligned. Now, in the management system of the client, it is important to also, as part of their own management system, they will have, say, a contractor management plan, and it should spell out the various requirements for the contractor and responsibilities. So I guess the short answer is it is important that they are aligned. It is important that any gaps be closed. And it is important that the solicitation piece of this process, the client ESMS is included. It can be the manual, for example, for the contractor to review it, understand it, and identify any challenges or gaps and how they're going to close it. This is a good question. The first one was around consolidating source documents. It doesn't need to be, it streamlines the process. There are many source documents out there. The ESIA and its commitment register, for example, are one piece of it. There's permits. There's maybe other lender information requirements. There's government approvals. But it is just the reality that a contractor getting this information in an annex in a solicitation and telling them you need to follow all the ESIA, you need to follow all these permits, you need to follow all this, they're not going to review it. They are not, probably, it's most likely they're not going to review it, or they're going to need extensive time to be able to review it, because it can be volumes of the ESIA. So by having, for example, a concise document which basically consolidates all this information and basically is like an instructional document for the contractor to follow, we found it to be extremely beneficial. It doesn't have to be huge. It really doesn't have to be huge. It's really just making sure that all the pieces are connected into one document for clarity by the contractor. In smaller projects, this can be quite a simple document. I've seen projects where you develop several CMPs, say one for waste, one for erosion control, one for water management. That's for, say, larger projects. I've also seen smaller projects have one document. It can be as small as a 50-page document for simple projects, which basically consolidates all the requirements of the EPC for that project, what they need to do, what their responsibilities are, what their organization needs to look like, etc. Rashnika, sorry, I didn't catch the second one. Could you repeat that one, please? I didn't.
Raymi, we actually need to close out, but people are asking if we can get back to them with the questions and answers. So we've made a copy of the questions, and I think we can aim to get back to everyone with the answers. We can post that along with the presentation and
sure, happy to answer them in writing, definitely.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you to everyone who joined. I just sent the link to evaluate today's webinar. I appreciate everyone's patience with the technical issues that we had. And I appreciate everyone's many questions. We value that very much. So thank you all for joining today.
Thank you.